Thank you. So again, tell them what you thought of the conference. We're really glad you're here. We're glad you're participating, and we're hoping to do it again a year from now. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great service that I think that we're providing. So on to our last session. We have Laura Solomon, who is here from OPLIN, which is a nice long library acronym, the Ohio Public Library Information Network in Columbus, Ohio. And she is the Library Services Manager there. And she's going to be talking about writing a social media policy for your library. So it looks like I just gave you control, Laura, and you should be able to bring up your screen. There we go.
Okay.
So whenever you are ready, go right ahead.
All right, I have a lot to talk about today, folks. So I was just mentioning to Jamie, there's way more than I can cover in just the time that we have allotted today. But I will ask if you have questions to throw them into the chat box. I love to address things in context rather than holding them all off till the end when I've forgotten what I was probably saying. So feel free to, and also if you have stories. I love stories. And when it comes to social media, it's all about stories, and there are a lot of stories about it. So I'm happy if you've got, if you've got a horror story from your library, that's always good fodder for me and also learning for everyone else. Or even a good story. It doesn't have to all be bad. But let's get diving into this with what we're going to cover today. So we're going to cover why have a social media policy. Chances are you might have a good idea about this already, or maybe you have your own experiences that would contribute to this feeling of, well, we ought to have one, but maybe you don't need one, and we'll talk a little bit about that also. What should actually go in a policy, which is really the meat and potatoes of why you probably came today. And lastly, just a little bit about some social media guidelines for participants. So in other words, we're covering kind of two ends of this, the end of employees posting stuff, which is going to be the bulk of things, and then patrons or online visitors and other folks out in social media who don't work for your library posting stuff online. Now, all of this has to be prefaced with this acronym. And if you're not familiar with this acronym, you're going to learn it now. It's all over the internet. It is, I am not a lawyer. And even if I were a lawyer, I would only be licensed for Ohio, and I probably wouldn't be any good to any of you anyway, because you're all from Wisconsin probably or other places. But I am not a lawyer. So if you're talking about the finer points of the law, I'm not going to be able to help you. I'm going to be giving you some broad perspectives here and some information that will help you write a policy. But I am not a lawyer, so all of your libraries typically have legal counsel of some kind, and you should definitely be referring to them. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I want to put that big disclaimer out there for the folks who just came in. I am not a lawyer, so let's make that really clear. So if you start asking me legal questions, it's just like at the reference desk. I can't help you. I can help you find an answer, but I can't just give you advice. So let's talk about why you probably need one for your library. This quote is from, as you can see, Elia Wright. He wrote a great book called The Necessary Evil. Any company, big or small, needs a social media policy to protect their reputations, even if their company has no social media presence. And this is the kicker here, because libraries will say to me, oh, well, we don't have a Facebook profile. It doesn't matter if your library is officially in social media or not. Your employees, chances are, at least one or two of them at least, are out somewhere on Facebook or G+ or Twitter someplace or whatever comes down the pike. They're going to be there creating one by what they're doing. So they may be creating one by the virtue of their actions online. So they're out there and they're doing stuff. So that's probably one of the big things. Also, your libraries almost certainly have discrimination policies, leave policies, vacation policies. You probably have a big binder of stuff or big binder of policies at your library. But you may not have a social media policy, and you probably really should have one. One lawyer, Daniel Handman, of a law firm called Hirschfeld Kramer LLP, told Bloomberg Law, social media policies are now just as necessary for employers as all of the ones that you see there above, plus all the other ones you probably have. This is not really something that's optional anymore, like, oh, it'd be kind of nice to have one. Well, from a legal standpoint, lawyers are probably going to tell you this isn't optional anymore. This is not just a nice thing to have. So why? Kind of more on the subject of why. Workplace social media policies have been gaining more and more attention recently, and I think that's really to be expected because the lines between personal and work lives are getting blurrier all the time. I myself, for many years, have never really separated out my personal from my professional life online. So you can guess I'm fairly careful about what I do online. It's too inconvenient for me, honestly, to separate them out. And that perspective is gaining more traction. People are talking about what they do at work online, not necessarily in the best way, but sometimes very positive ways. But those lines are blurring. And so managers of libraries can expect that there's going to be more issues with social media and the employees, because employees were all spending way more time on social media sites. Is anyone here not spending tons of time online and social media? And you can just throw something in the chat. Yes, we're all addicted to Facebook, or no, I hate Facebook, or feel free to respond. I always love responses in the chat box. But most of us probably are spending more time online, and certainly the stats prove that out. So this all kind of really begs the question, when we talk about a social media policy, can employees say what they want? Do they have free speech rights to publicly say, I hate my boss, or I hate the library I work at? Especially now when we are in this social media age, when venting on Facebook or Twitter or wherever has kind of replaced the traditional complaining that we used to do, you know, they say around the water cooler, but honestly it happened everywhere in the office and out to lunch, and that's still happening. But now it's happening sort of out in this public forum. The answer to this question, can employees say what they want, is as fuzzy and as nuanced as you'd probably expect from anything that has legal connotations or considerations. So the answer really is not going to be very definitive for you, and I apologize in advance, but it's the reality we live in. The answer is sometimes. To really talk about this at any length, and we want to do that at least a little bit today, we have to take a look at the National Labor Relations Board, excuse me, and specifically about the act that created that, which is the National Labor Relations Act. Now, here's a little bit of a history lesson. It was passed in 1935 by Congress. You don't have to remember that. But what that act did is very important. Even though it was created or passed in 1935, it has a lot to do with social media, and here's how. What that act did is it basically gave employees protections, which include the right to engage in what's called, imagine I'm making quote signs here, concerted activity for collective bargaining or other mutual aid. That's the language of the act. This was initially created to protect unionized workers, but the way that it's written, it actually protects all employees. It applies to everyone, not just those who belong to a union. And before the rise of social media, that law really was probably almost never used in non-union workplaces because, well, especially, you know, workers complained about their jobs, but it wasn't in such a visible way. So this law was created to encourage collective bargaining and to possibly curtail dangerous workplace policies. And we'll talk a little more about this in just a minute. One thing I want to note, though, this is the screenshot from the front page of the National Labor Relations Board. Over the past year to 2 years, the NLRB has started sending out memos to corporations, and I don't know if that includes any libraries. There's no way for me to get a list that I know of, but certainly libraries would come under this. But they've released a series of memos on the lawfulness of corporate social media policies. Basically, they've started scrutinizing workplace social media policies. And the reason they're sending out these memos is because they found that one of the most common offenses, problems that they found, was that the companies or the organizations are restricting employees from discussing what they consider, the companies might consider, confidential information, such as wages or working conditions with coworkers on social media. And the policies were saying, no, you can't do that. And that is not true. Here's the deal. If a work rule has the potential to reasonably discourage an employee from organizing or bargaining collectively, it's against the law. Employees have the right to complain publicly if they think that their employer's labor practices are unfair. So, for example, if I complain on LinkedIn that someone else is making more money than me and it's unfair, that's a protected activity. And then if you go and fire me for disclosing what you consider to be confidential salary information because I said I only make so much and it's not fair, but you think I should be fired because that information should be confidential, you're going to lose in court almost certainly because that's a protected activity. So if your social media policy prohibits something like that, you're opening your company up to possible big problems. So bottom line is that your social media can't limit free speech. As much as you as a manager, if you are a manager, might wish it so, it just isn't going to happen. So you can't restrict employees from using social media. You can't necessarily control what they say in social media. However, if you have in your social media policy restrictions that are sort of what they say subordinated to other clauses, like for example, if you say you cannot sexually harass or racially, use a racial slur on social media, and of course that's probably in your code of conduct for your employees anyway, that's allowed. That is not the same thing as restricting free speech in this case. Again, talk to your lawyer, but that's the general context. What the NLRB is really looking for is really overly broad restrictions. So lawyers typically encourage people or organizations to have social media policies, but not to tell their employees that they can't comment about certain things. And also, when you're writing your policy, it might be really good to make clear that, hey, you know what, if you have a problem with someone at the library, with your boss or someone else, you need to take care of it in person first before you start spouting off on social media. It doesn't mean they're going to do it, but it's a strong suggestion that you can make. So coming back to this idea of concerted activity, and this is probably more than you ever wanted to know, right? But it's kind of important that you know this. So the question really, when you start looking at something that you as a library might say, I'm not so sure about what they just posted, the question's often going to come down to whether the speech is considered to be concerted activity. Remember, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, this is what the big concern was. Is you can't outlaw concerted activity against unfair labor practices. So generally, how that's been interpreted to mean in court is that it has to involve more than one employee. So if someone posts something on Facebook and no one comments, it's probably not considered concerted activity. Very interesting. And I don't know if likes count or not. That's a lawyer question. I have that question too, and I have not been able to find out so far. If any lawyers are in the audience, I hope they tell me because I would love to get some opinions on that. But at any rate, if it's just one person spouting off, that may not be concerted activity. However, courts also are not going to support any language that's considered to be threatening in any way. So that's just a quick overview, more than, again, you probably wanted to know, of concerted activity. But it's important to consider when you start looking at iffy posts online. Some folks think this never happens in libraries. It absolutely does, and maybe some of you have experienced this in libraries. This particular story I'm about to tell you actually made USA Today earlier this year, so I guarantee you it happens in libraries, and it, in this case, got national attention. Hopefully none of your libraries will ever do that. But what happened, I won't give out names. The link, if you want the link for the story, I'd be happy to provide it. But just to give you an idea, there was a library aide who in Minnesota, who was fired after a disagreement about things that she was writing on her personal Facebook page. And according to the library, the library aide was terminated for quote-unquote inappropriate behavior and refusal to agree to performance expectations. The library aide said that she voiced her opinion at a staff meeting that pay for library aides had to be increased, and later she was told that her tone was disrespectful. The library aide said that she was just being her typical self, kind of outspoken but not angry, and apparently this library aide frequently vented about the management of the library on her Facebook page, occasionally using one of her supervisor's first names and sometimes letters that, or words that had 4 letters or other words that were not appropriate. Her Facebook, this is the kicker here, her Facebook account settings were public, so anyone could see her posts. The library aide said that she was called into a meeting with the administrators who handed her printouts of all her Facebook posts from the past few months before the meeting. She was suspended. Later she was fired when she refused to sign a performance expectation letter. And the library aide, she said, and this, some of you might laugh, but this is the story, the library aide said that she felt that the library managers monitoring her personal Facebook page intruded on her privacy. I don't know where this story has gone since. but it's a pretty clear indication that this library probably did not have a social media policy, because otherwise this would probably not have made such a splash, because a lot of this could have probably been covered under a policy and it would have been able to terminate her without nearly as much controversy if she needed to be terminated. So back to why. In this time when this distinction between personal and professional stuff is fading and everybody's got a Facebook or Twitter profile, a social media policy is really a useful way to set some ground rules for your employees with regards to what they're doing online. And it's a reminder also that the content they post isn't private. Even if we'll talk a little more about this in a while, but even if you post, and you probably all know this, but even if you post something online, it doesn't mean, and it's private, it doesn't necessarily mean it's really private. And ultimately, it can reflect on the library. So also, the employee's expectation of privacy kind of decreases with the amount of notice they're given about monitoring. So telling them up front, hey, your stuff's going to possibly be monitored, is not a bad thing, and they should expect that. Now, we're talking about policy, and it's really, really hard to talk about policy and employees in the same breath without at least mentioning human resources. If you have employees out there on Facebook trashing your library, you better believe that your human resources department is probably going to get involved or should be involved. So anytime that you are writing a social media policy, this is one of the parties that you need to bring to the table, because they're going to have some expertise that can help you, because that's kind of their job, is to talk about employee policy. So don't leave them out of the process here. It's really important. One of the problems about social media for libraries or any other employer is this dangerous magnifying effect, because we all know, right, somebody complains, and then what happens? They complain on their Facebook wall or out on Twitter. It doesn't matter. I mean, I'll name tools all day. It could be any tool. They complain, and then what happens? Somebody else says, hey, yeah, I hate that too. And then suddenly it becomes bigger, and it becomes much more difficult to stop once it's begun, if not impossible. So this is something else that if you're kind of on the fence about a social media policy, here's yet another reason why. Now, chances are pigs don't fly at your library, unless they're maybe Cincinnati. Their symbol, by the way, is not the library, but the city is a flying pig. So maybe they have flying pigs, but probably none of us have flying pigs at our library. So a problem is that social media makes false information really difficult to dispel. I don't know, has anyone here ever had this come up at their library where something went out online and it wasn't true? Please feel free to put stuff in the chat, because I hate talking to myself. I talk fast, but it doesn't mean I don't want to talk to you. But if something is heard or read enough times, people who are reading this stuff that's not true tend to think that they are true. So if you have someone at your library who posts to their Facebook or whatever and says, oh, I hate the self-check machines, they never work. Well, it turns out it's only one machine and it works intermittently, but they're, sort of exaggerating and saying, I hate them all. That's really hard to deal with once it's out there and people say, I hate them too, and they all jump on this bandwagon or people share it. So I want to talk very briefly. I'm not even going to read this to you. It's out there. But I want to just kind of share this with you because I think it's worth giving it some thought. There is another side to this whole, oh, you should have a social media policy coin. Here is a list of 5 reasons from Michael Hyatt. You've seen the URL right down there if you want to read sort of more about this. But very briefly, I mean, he is of the opinion basically that your employees can be trusted. That may not be the case for all of us. Not all of us are as trusting as Mr. Hyatt. Maybe not all of us should be as trusting. I don't know. You can tell, obviously, I tend to veer towards one side of the fence that involves actually having a social media policy. But if you're in a very small library and it's you and maybe one other person, this may be overkill. I understand that. So this may be worth a read for you. Formal policies only discourage people from participating. I think that's possible. But we're going to talk about how you can potentially write one so that you're not necessarily going to discourage everyone from going out and doing social media. You really don't want to discourage them, just as a side note. So all of this comes down to Oh, and Jean has posted my slides. Thank you. To this, really, and I think we kind of all knew this. The honeymoon with social media is over. It's everywhere. And now also it's becoming more of an integral part of everything that we do. And when I say we, I mean as libraries. Is there any, I can't imagine, but are there any folks here who don't use social media or whose library doesn't use social media? And that's okay. I'm not going to discriminate. People have heard me talk about social media before and know that I'm not an evangelist for social media. That's not what I do. I spend way too much time on it, but I'll never force anyone else to do it. No takers? Either that or you're all asleep. Okay. So anyway, the honeymoon is over. So let's talk now about what goes in it, because that's really what you've all been waiting for. You're like, Laura, get past the boring stuff. I already know I want one. Just get to it. So let's get to it. What actually goes in the thing? All right, I'm going to make you sit through one more slide, sorry, before we actually get to what's in it, because there are 3 big rules you've got to know before you start writing this thing. 1, be specific. Now, this does not mean get your lawyer to write it for you. You will be a sad panda if your lawyer writes your social media policy, because nobody will be able to understand it. And I have good friends who are lawyers, so this is not an anti-lawyer rant. But the fact is that's what they're trained to do, is to write, yes, in very specific language, but also in a way that is not necessarily readable for the average person. And you want to talk about discouraging people from reading a policy, write it in legalese. That will be the end. Nobody will read it. So you do want to be specific, but don't ask your lawyer to write it. You'll notice number 3 down there. I'm going to skip number 2 for a second. Consult a lawyer. You want to consult a lawyer. Write it and then take it to a lawyer just to review it for potential problems. That's all. Not to have them rewrite it. Have them suggest changes, yes, but don't let them actually write the thing. So be specific, because misinformation can be misunderstood, which makes it harder to implement. So yeah, social networks change all the time, but that's not an excuse for being lazy with the details, okay? And you're probably going to need to revise this more frequently than some other policies. Chances are you already have a policy about policies in your library where maybe you say, we review this one every 2 years or maybe every year. At the very least, your social media policy needs to be reviewed annually. That's minimum. Chances are good you may need to review it more than that, maybe even every 3 to 6 months. And you're going, who has time for that? I know, I'm just telling you what the recommendation is. Do the best you can. So let's come back to write in a friendly tone. This is where we get into the not discouraging people from using social media. There is a real benefit to having people out there who are talking about your library, and some of you may have experienced that. I have seen many, many librarians who go, I love where I work. They just did this really cool thing. I am so glad we're finally doing this. You can't buy that kind of PR. You want that happening. So you don't want to be discouraging your employees, your staff from doing this. So write it in a friendly tone and emphasize the positive. And this is really hard, because if you look at just like library signage, it's all really nasty, passive, not all right, I'm overgeneralizing, but much of it is nasty, passive-aggressive stuff. You shall not. Don't write it that way. Here, I just said don't. But do your best to write it as a do, not as a list of do's, not a list of don'ts. And that's hard, I know. But one way that you can do that is to start with the purpose of social media. Introduce it to your staff. Even excuse me, I'm fighting off the rest of a bronchial infection. So even if your staff uses social media all the time, they may not understand its purpose in your organization. So you want to say, you know, you want to focus on the things that employees can do, why the library is doing this, rather than focusing on the things that they can't do. We want you to talk about the library, but we don't want you to talk about it in a really mean, nasty way. That's basically the spirit of it. So we want you to do this, but you need to understand that we want you to do this because if you're going to talk specifically about your place of employment, we want you to do it in a way that reflects well on you and the organization. You also need to make sure, here we're definitely talking about things that go in the policy, by the way, be honest about who you are. I work for the state of Ohio. I'm a state of employee, and our state, if you're a state employee and you are allowed to use social media on work time, you actually have to be granted that specifically, and I'm lucky enough to be one of those, then you have to be very clear on your social media profiles. My opinion, basically, there's something to the effect of my opinions are my own, not my employer's, something along those lines. You should be authentic. You want your employers to be authentic. You want them to include their name, and be clear that, hey, if you're posting about the library, you darn well better disclose that you work at that library. Don't pretend that you don't. That's not authentic. That's not honest. So they need to be candid about who they are and who they work for. Just as an example, this is the entirety of Zappos.com's social media policy. That's it. You might be imagining, because you're probably looking at other policies in your library, you might be imagining that it's pages long. Even big corporations don't have more than maybe a couple pages, maybe 3, maybe. But Zappos, one of the huge internet company, they sell way more than shoes. This is their social media policy, and they are well known for their use of social media. They literally train every single employee in their organization to use social media on behalf of the organization, to use it to talk to customers and to promote the organization. Every single person is trained to do that. It's fantastic. This is their social media policy in its entirety. Thomas Knoll, who's one of the executives for Zappos.com, rephrased it another way, and it's a little funny, but it says, our social media policy is be yourself and don't be stupid. That's it. That's all they've got. And, you talk about trusting employees. I think this is a great example here. They know they have well-trained employees. They don't need pages of stuff. You also need folks to understand that they are responsible for what they write. Sometimes people tend to interpret having the right to express themselves online as sort of meaning there's no consequences for what they say, and that's not true. If they're saying something that's not real smart, yeah, there are consequences, and we'll mention that a little more later. So your library as an organization and its representatives, the staff, they have to take responsibility for what they write. And here's, remember Zappos, we just saw that a slide ago, use their best judgment, right? Has anyone here ever heard the term DOOCED? This was something I ran across recently. I'm going to put it into the chat. It's DOOCED. You don't want this happening in your organization. This is when someone is fired because of something they said in social media or on a blog or on a website. It's to be DOOCED, is when you get fired for that. You don't want that to happen. So your employees don't want that to happen. So you don't have to use this word in social media policy, but you want your employees to use common sense, and you want them to be responsible. Okay, slides, come on. There we go. So here's a slightly longer bit that I will not read to you because I know that you all can read. But this is from Intel. Obviously, it's got the big logo on the big left. This was just a piece of their social media policy. Besides, it is longer than Zappos. Obviously, Intel has even more than this, so it's longer, so they've taken a different approach. But one of the other things here I'd like you to note, besides just the language itself, is to take a look at the tone of it. Is that this is much more positive than, don't do this. They're trying to keep it more upbeat and still be clear. The language is specific, and it's clear, and it's commonsensical. So nobody's going to read this and go, I don't understand it. Well, okay, you probably go, I have someone in my library who won't understand. Okay, there's always one. But most people are not going to look at this and be confused. They want you to think about what you're posting, and I think this is a great example. You obviously want people to be accurate, and this comes along with responsibility. Your staff have to be responsible for checking the accuracy of whatever they post online. And so they need to ensure that the posts are not only factually correct, but they also recommend that whenever possible, provide supporting sources and give attribution. They also need to separate fact from opinion, and sometimes that can get lost in posts that are not clear. Make sure that the audience can see the difference. Post what your opinions, but make clear that it is in fact your opinion and not a fact. So if I'm that employee saying, oh, all the self-checkout machines don't work, I hate them, that's not a fact, it's an opinion. The fact would be one isn't working and it's giving me problems. So that's a little different. We saw this next bit in Zappos, but use good judgment. Some policies will say things like refrain from comments that can be interpreted as slurs, demeaning, inflammatory. One policy said the internet's full of varied opinions and it's okay to share yours, but you never, 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 never want to be branded a racist or narrow-minded or an unstoppable hothead. Again, clear language, and it makes the point of, you are responsible for what you write. So here we have this overlap of personal and professional that we know is happening more and more. And I'm sorry, because I think someone asked me a question in the question box, which was collapsed, so hang on a second. Sorry, don't mean to be quiet here, but I have...
Someone asked, does this also cover email language?
I just saw that. I can't get my chat box to, it doesn't want to expand very much, or my question box. Sorry, so I'm like paging through it. Does it also cover email language? That is a really good question. I don't think it would if you're labeling it as a social media policy. However, this is that horrible acronym I'm going to be saying all day. I am not a lawyer. And even if I were, I would not be practicing in your state. So my initial thought is it probably doesn't because it's a different medium, even though it's online. But that is definitely a question for your lawyer, and that's a good question that I had not really considered. If you find out, I would like to know. That's the first time I've been asked that, so that's a really good question. I appreciate it, and thanks for being patient while I went back to look at that. I'm going to ask folks, if you can, to please put things into the chat rather than the question box. I don't. Jamie, do people have access to that or just the question box?
They just have a question box.
Okay. So it's just me and I can't get it to go bigger. Sorry, folks.
You can pull
I don't mean to be ignoring you.
You can pull the corner to make it bigger, I think.
It won't really let me.
Okay.
I know it's supposed to do that, and it's not.
Okay.
So it's,
no worries.
I work in technology, and it hates my guts.
There's a little panel that says you can undock it, and if you undock it, you can make it bigger.
Okay, I can see this now in the eval. She spent too much time fussing.
Well, whoops.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mixing these two things. And I'll try to keep an eye on what I can. An example social media policies available at the end. Actually, I'm going to give you more social media, access to more social media policies than you'll ever want to look at in your life. So yes. You'll hate me for giving you these links. So let's talk a little bit about this overlap. Be really clear that if they being your staff, if they are mixing things together, which we often do, so if they're talking about their workplace on their personal Facebook profile, they need to be conscious of that. These two things often do intersect online. And remind employees, we've kind of said this already, but remind them that everything that is posted online, even when channels or profiles are private or protected or whatever, eventually they can still be seen by anyone, right? The internet is forever. People share and post and take screenshots. Nothing's really private anymore. The only way to be private is not to post it. That's the bottom line, and I think a lot of us now are more savvy about that than we used to be. Make that clear to your employees. Intel, by the way, has a really great piece that I don't have up here, but they say in online social networks, the lines between public and private, personal and professional are blurred. Just by identifying yourself as an Intel employee, you are creating perceptions about your expertise and about Intel by our shareholders, customers, and the general public, and perceptions about you by your colleagues and managers. Do us all proud. Be sure that all content associated with you is consistent with your work and Intel's values and professional standards. I think that's an awesome, positive way to approach this. Now, I don't like talking about copyright because I am not a copyright guru by any means, but because I do web development stuff, really that's my main job, and I create graphics, I have been in the position now several times of having my graphics stolen unbelievably by other libraries. Yes, this really happens. Yes, it has happened to me. So I am perhaps more aware of copyright than I might have been at one time. So this really should be no-brainer, but it does happen in libraries. If you take something or are using something, and yes, there's fair use. I'm not saying that you can't do that, but always give proper credit. Here's the problem is when people take things and then don't attribute them. That's the real problem. So make sure that if you are taking something and say where it came from, give credit whenever possible. Not a complex. There is confidential stuff in libraries, even though we're, at least public, I'm thinking specifically of public libraries. We have the sunshine laws where we can't be hiding a lot of what we do. But nonetheless, there is private stuff in libraries, right? What about patron information? We're very protective of that. You know, many ILSs, that as soon as you return a book, that information's gone. You can't find out what somebody checked out, and that's for a reason. So being really clear that people can't name patrons is probably something you're going to want to include. Years ago, just when, I mean, I'm really dating myself here, when blogs kind of took off, I actually worked in a library where someone had a personal blog and they were telling stories about patrons, particularly patrons that weren't particularly desirable, and they were naming them. And eventually administration found out, and this person got basically a slap on the wrist. Nowadays, I can't even imagine that person not being fired, considering what a huge violation of privacy that was. But this is way back in the day before we even had social media, just as, you know, blogging was the big new thing. But you can't be doing that in social media, and that seems pretty obvious, but it's something that you should be spelling out. We all complain about our colleagues, most of us. We often don't have, you know, we get a little cranky sometimes, but we do have to respect them. And something you might want to put in your policy is asking specifically for employees to respect their colleagues and to consider their privacy. So avoid posting, for example, photos, videos, or any internal, you know, you talk about emails. This is maybe where emails would come into play. You know, take an email and posting it to your blog or your Facebook wall, that could be a real problem. So the person who asked about that, that's something you might want to take to your lawyer also, but without their permission. So if I, you know, even if we're having a great time at a program and I take your picture and I post it to my Facebook wall and I haven't asked you, you know, there may be a very good reason why you don't like to be in pictures. You may be, you know, avoiding an ex-spouse. There are many good reasons people have for not wanting their personal information or pictures of themselves online. So make sure that you always ask. That's something that probably needs to be spelled out in your policy. Another thing, avoid fighting, right? Nobody wants their library involved in a flame war because some staff person decided to take on a cranky patron online. So if you have a difference of opinion with someone, or you want to post about something controversial, make sure that the employee does it in a professional way. No matter how they feel about it, they're going to have to handle it professionally because they are working for the library. So it's okay to voice an opinion, but don't let your employees use social media for personal attacks, you know, nasty inflammatory arguments. And again, this is another place maybe to remind them what you post isn't private and it can impact the library. You don't want this reflecting bad on the library, and that's really what this is all about. So here's a section from IBM. Don't pick fights. Be the first to correct your own mistakes. I like that bit. And don't alter previous posts without indicating that you have done so. I'd be very interested to know how that got there, what experiences the folks at IBM had to put that little piece in there, but I think it's a very relevant piece that maybe we would want to borrow. Another thing you might want to spell out in your policy, particularly in a big library, is who's actually in charge of the social media. It might be very tempting for some of your staff to jump onto the library's Facebook wall to answer questions, even if it's not anything controversial. But it could be that that is the responsibility of someone else who's trained to deal with that, or has a specific procedure for handling questions posted to the Facebook wall. Spell that out. If you have a PR person or other person in your organization who's supposed to do that, say that.
Maybe in your library it's not a specific person per se, maybe you have a bunch of people, but maybe there's one person who deals with the negative things, and maybe that is the PR person or some other person in your library organization. Say that so that people know, hey, I can't just jump on and start answering questions, or oh, that person's asking something kind of touchy. I don't handle that. They need to know that up front. You also want to be clear about consequences of what their actions might be online. So social media doesn't occur in a vacuum. So a post that a staff person might have meant just for their Facebook friends, which could be hundreds, who knows, can wind up on the front page of Reddit, heaven forbid. You don't want that. So there have to be consequences. Again, this goes back to being responsible. Even if they're at home on their own time, what they say can impact the library. So you have to define the consequences of what can happen if they do something that they shouldn't be doing. If they post a racial slur or sexually harassing someone. What are the, something that's going to cast the library in a negative light that you've already spelled out, hey, you really can't do this. What are the consequences? Is it written discipline? Is it being fired? That's really going to be situational, but you need to be clear that there are going to be consequences and give the range of consequences. And this is where your HR person can be very helpful. Excuse me. So consult the employee manual, because chances are a lot of this stuff, and you might remember back to the slide about the from Michael Hyatt saying why you might not need a social media policy. A lot of this stuff may already be spelled out in your manual, in your other policies, and you can pull from that. And that gives you actually a stronger position if something can happen, because you can say, what, this isn't just our social media policy. You're not allowed to sexually harass someone in our employee manual either. This is not new. It's just the medium is different. So many existing policies that govern employee behavior also can extend to the online world as well, and you want to make those connections when you can. You also want to make clear, again, this goes back to encouraging people, right? Because as tempting as it is to discourage people from posting stuff, because it's easier if they don't post anything, I know, but that's not realistic. They're going to do it. But while they're out there, you want them to provide some value. Well, what does that mean? Ask your staff, if they're using social media and they're talking about the library or on behalf of the library, think about what can they offer your community, whatever that community is. Is it going to be a thoughtful, relevant blog post, newsy kinds of tweets, homework help, but they should focus on providing that consistently if they're going to do it. Ask them, look for opportunities in social media to offer recommendations or the homework help, or say, hey, look, we've got this service, and provide value to the community. That's really what you'd like them to do, not just go out and kvetch about your workplace. That's the ideal. So I want to give you a couple extra pieces that were not on slides. This is from Columbus Metropolitan Library. They were kind enough to provide me with a copy of their social media policy, which is actually in my latest book, if you're interested. That it is not, these aren't like general things that you will find in advice out there, so to speak. These are specific, but I thought they were really, really smart additions. Don't reference or cite library clients, partners, or customers without their express consent. So if you're wondering, how to not talk about patrons online, here's some language. And this piece here, I see this as a problem not just in social media, but in all sorts of ways with libraries. Many libraries, especially larger ones, have style guides where it's specifically laid out how a logo can and cannot be used. And often logos get slapped on all kinds of things without consulting style guides, which is a violation of policy, essentially. So they're making very clear to their staff, hey, you can't use our library logo or our trademarks without our consent. You can't put our brand, essentially, on your stuff without us giving you permission to do that. So all well and good, you've got one of these things, you've got a social media policy, but it's not enough just to have a social media policy. You've got to spend as much time and effort training people on the social media policy as you did probably writing it. Because, nothing can stop human behavior, just like employee handbooks aren't going to stop people, and haven't, they haven't stopped people from breaking the rules. People still do it. But you need to make it very clear, hey, this is a priority for our organization. And just because people break the rules doesn't mean that you don't train people on the rules. You need to make it clear to them, hey, we put some value on this. We want you to do this way. So I'm going to switch gears here for just a little bit to talk about the other end of things in terms of, okay, now we've got a Facebook wall where people can post things, not just the library, because hopefully it's not just you. Yes, you can set your Facebook wall or, again, any tool, but just to put it in perspective for Facebook as the example. Don't set your wall to just you posting. That defeats the entire point of social media. You need people to engage with you. That's really the bottom line. So you have a policy, yes, for your employees. That's your social media policy. But then you have this other thing, this other document or policy that may not even be called a policy. In some places it is called a policy. One of the more common names is a takedown policy, which is very sort of brute force-ish. Is that a word? Or more often they're called participant guidelines or social media participation guidelines or something, commenting or posting policies. There's all kinds of names. There's not a standard name for this thing. But regardless of the name, the idea is the same. It's a policy that can back up what your library allows people to post on your library's social media profiles. So I mentioned one of the names is a takedown policy because that's kind of what it does. I mean, it's a very descriptive name, as negative as it might be. It basically says this is what we can remove from our social media profile, and so don't do these things. Oftentimes, libraries get very antsy about social media, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this also, where because, oh, somebody's going to post something bad. Well, yeah, somebody might post something bad, but it's the post saying, I don't like the library shouldn't be coming down. It's the really bad things you should be concerned with the, I'm calling everyone at the library some kind of, negative racial stereotype or something, or, saying nasty things about the librarians with obscenities, and, again, consult your lawyer, but that's the kind of thing really that a takedown policy really addresses. Law enforcement agencies, by the way, on Facebook, they typically do call them takedown policies. And one of the interesting things that they recommend to their agencies that I think a library may want to consider is they recommend that once you remove something, it's a good idea to keep it, along with a notation as to why it was removed in case it ever comes back to them. They can say, you know what, here's our copy of it, here's our policy, our takedown policy. This is, you can see pretty clearly why this got removed. So I want to show you a couple examples here. This is from archives.gov, just a bit of their takedown policy. And it's pretty clear about what kind of things they're going to take down from their social media profiles. They're not going to allow people to spam. They're not going to allow people to be threatening or use harassing language or personal attacks. And again, here's the link so you can see the policy in its entirety with the slides. Healthcare is a little different, but they too allow interaction, which I think is fantastic. So this is a community hospital. So they've also got more to the policy, which is why I've included the link. But I wanted to include this bit because I think it also provides some useful perspective. So they're protecting intellectual property rights and privacy as well. So if someone starts talking about patients, on a full name basis or any identifiable way, they reserve the right to take that down because that's not cool, especially on a hospital site. So when you start looking at this, what's the end goal of these two things, the social media policy and the takedown policy? The point of a social media policy is for employees to be empowered. You want your staff to be empowered, and you also want yourself to be empowered, as yourself being the library or the library manager. You want to be empowered. You want to be planning ahead so that if something happens, you have some recourse. That's really what the end goal of this. The point of a takedown policy or a participant guideline policy for your end users, for the public, is to keep your community running smoothly and to protect your library, but mostly to keep the community running smoothly, because probably many of us have been involved in online communities or forums or groups where it just got nasty and you said, you know what, I'm out of here. I don't want to deal with this drama anymore. You don't want your Facebook profile or any other profile to become the drama llama. You don't want the one where people are posting screenshots going, can you believe what's going on such and such a library's page? Not a good idea. So it protects you and keeps your community happy too. So there was a question about resources. So I'm going to give you two. There are a lot more, but I think this will give you probably more than you'll ever need. This first one is short, but I think that in some of those examples were included in this particular presentation, so you're going to see some duplication there. But I think it dates, but the nice thing about social media policies that are written well is that they don't date badly. So it is a little dated at 2009, but I have kept it around because it has such great examples. Chances are those organizations have updated their policies a little bit, but they're still very well written. Probably more of interest is this last one. There's an entire database here at socialmediagovernance.com. Right now there's about 250 policies. There's more all the time, and if you think you've got a really good one, you can put it in there too. And this ranges from large corporations to universities to organizations like the Red Cross, many, many social media policies where you can look at it and go, I like the way they said that. Oh, I didn't even think to do that. That's the kind of thing that you want. You won't wade through all these because you'll probably fall asleep first, but many of them are very well written. So I'd like to take any questions that I might have missed or that you might have had.
All right, thank you, Laura.
And
well,
also thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Laura. There was a comment that came through from Rebecca, and she said, I never thought about needing this, so thank you so much for the info.
Oh, very welcome.
I think it's great. Some of the other comments that came through, one of them was, I don't spend a lot of time on social media sites. I do spend time on LinkedIn. Facebook page existed for the library that had not been started by the library.
Ooh, ouch.
Yeah. On Facebook and Twitter a lot, not as familiar with Tumblr and Pinterest, so hoping to hear how to handle policy so it works for unknown sites. Christine said this was great. I really need to develop one. So do you have one for your, I'm imagining your organization is pretty small, right? Because you're kind of like a system, like we are.
Well, we're not a consortium, but trying to explain OPLIN is always so hard. We're not weird, but we're a weird little agency. We have 5 employees. So, and only 2 of us do social media on behalf of the agency. And I'll be honest, our agency doesn't do very much with social media, and that's because we are so small. And maybe if you have a small library, that's an issue too. We do not have one. I suspect, though, that if we were actually to get bigger, it would become a necessity.
Okay. Okay. Any other, I'm not seeing any questions come through, but it sounds like you provided a lot of good resources for people that have a policy and want to tweak theirs or who are thinking of creating a policy. Any last words or thoughts on what you talked about? Do you think all of this is just going to get even more complicated and convoluted as social media evolves, or what do you think? I
think I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think it's going to. I think a lot more stuff is going to have to hit the courtrooms before they really, it starts to solidify more than they already have. When there becomes, because with many policies now, lawyers can say, yeah, there's standard clauses for this, there's standard clauses for that. That is not necessarily the case yet for social media policies because I don't think there's a lot of court precedent. So I think once more people or more organizations start suing, you're going to that's my final thought. Yeah, more litigation. I think you're going to see more of this. But again, I am not a lawyer.
We will end on that note.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you to all of you who joined in for this session and any of the other ones. The slides and the recordings are in your follow-up email from GoToWebinar. A lot of the recordings are already up. I'm putting them up as soon as they're available. We appreciate your participation that you've had throughout this whole conference, and your questions and your comments. It's what makes these webinars interesting. So have a great week, and we will talk to you hopefully at the 2015 Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. Thanks, and good night.